Good evening, everybody. Nice to see y'all. Hey, let's go ahead and stand and we're going to open up some worship. Hi, Robin. I'm waving back. Nice to see you. How deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that He should give His only Son to make a wretch His treasure. How great the pain of searing loss, the Father turned His face away, as wounds which mar the chosen one bring many sons to glory. Behold the man upon the cross, my sin upon His shoulders. Ashamed, I hear my mocking voice call out among the scoffers. It was my sin that held Him there until it was accomplished. His dying breath has brought me life. I know that it is finished. I will not boast in anything. No gifts, no power, no wisdom. But I will boast in Jesus Christ, His death and resurrection. Why should I gain from His reward? I cannot give an answer, but this I know with all my heart: His wounds have paid my ransom. But this I know with all my heart: His wounds have paid my ransom. Sing, great is thy faithfulness. Great is thy faithfulness, O God my Father. There is no shadow of turning with thee. Thou changest not, thy compassions, they fail not. As thou hast been, thou forever wilt be. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Pardon for sin and the peace that endureth, today and bright hope for tomorrow. Blessings all mine with 10,000 beside. Great is thy faithfulness. Great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Great is thy faithfulness. Great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness. Great is thy faithfulness. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. I'm calling on the God of Jacob, whose love endures through generations. I know that you will keep your covenant. I'm calling on the God of Moses, the one who opened up the ocean. I need you now to do the same thing for me, for me. Oh God, my God, I need you. Oh God, my God, I need you now. Oh, I need you now. Oh rock of ages, I'm standing on your faithfulness, on your faithfulness. I'm calling on the God of Mary, whose favor rests upon the lowly. I know with you all things are possible. I'm calling on the God of David, who made a shepherd boy courageous. I may not face Goliath, but I've got my own giants. Oh God, my God, I need you. Oh God, my God, I need you now. Oh, I need you now. Oh rock of ages, I'm standing on your faithfulness, on your faithfulness. Oh God, my God, I need you. Oh God, my God, I need you now. Oh, I need you now. Oh rock of ages, I'm standing on your faithfulness, on your faithfulness. Your children then, you hear your children now. You are the same my God, I need you. Oh God, my God, I need you now. Oh, I need you now. Oh rock of ages, I'm standing on your faithfulness. On your faithfulness. Oh God, my God, I need you. Oh God, my God, I need you now. Oh, I need you now. Hey, oh rock of ages, I'm standing on your faithfulness. On your faithfulness. You may be seated. We're now going to move into a time of prayer. This is something we do every Wednesday. And this is an opportunity for you to take some time out of your week, to slow down, to remove yourself from stressful situations, and to just spend this time dedicated in prayer. We have a busy world we live in, and it's often difficult for us to slow down. So we want to create that opportunity for you. Slow down, rest, bring your anxieties, your worries, your thanksgiving to the Lord. And then after that, Pastor Cody will be continuing in 2 Samuel.
Thank you, Lord God, once again for your faithfulness to us, God. I thank you for just another opportunity we have to gather together, to worship you, to encourage each other, to seek you in your word, Lord, in prayer. I pray that you would be with us here this evening, God. I pray that you would open our hearts and our minds to the message you have for us, Lord. I pray that you would speak to us through your eternal, perfect word, Lord. I pray that we would take these things to heart, Lord, that they would transform our lives, God, as we become more like you from the inside out and live our lives more for your glory each day. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, good evening, everybody. It looks like we're back to the dark, cold Wednesday night thing, so glad you decided to come out and join us for that. Maybe not the best time to be outside doing stuff anymore, but it's a great opportunity to come here somewhere warm and dry and study God's Word. So glad you guys are here. Have you ever faced a situation that seemed hopeless? Something where you thought that there was no way out, that it was impossible, that this could possibly end well, that there's no way that God could still be at work in the midst of whatever was going on, whatever trial you were facing, whatever it is that you were just stuck in the middle of. I think most of us at one time or another have faced something like that. And it is oftentimes so difficult to deal with those things, to keep our eyes fixed on God and continue moving forward through those challenges. But I think a lot of the time, those challenges are really some of our greatest opportunities for growth. That at times, the hardest things we face, those impossible situations, the ones where we have almost completely lost hope, that those are the ones where we see God work the most. And that's kind of where we're going this evening. We're going to be in 2 Samuel chapter 17 once more. And so 2 Samuel, again, as I've mentioned before, is really the story of David, of his reign over the people of Israel, and the highs and lows that come with that. So the first part of the book focuses primarily on the highs, that David was doing, really it seemed, a great job of leading God's people, of honoring God, of staying close to God in his own personal life, and following and honoring him. As we get into the middle portion of the book, we see David make some mistakes. We see David fall into what's kind of known as his great sin of adultery and murder. And we see the consequences that followed that in the later portions of the book. And so we're smack dab in the middle of that right now, that David had committed these sins. He was told by the prophet Nathan that there were going to be consequences for that, that God was going to give him discipline for what he had done. There was going to be some difficulties that come through that. But we also have seen God work through those, that David is being chastened by God for his willing and knowing sinful actions against God. But at the same time, God is still remaining faithful to David. God is still working for the good of David in the midst of these things. And God is working to bring about good in the end, in spite of David's sin and in spite of the whole mess of different things and different consequences that David is dealing with. And so at this point, David's son Absalom has decided to stage a coup to overthrow his father as king, to seize the throne, and to gather the people of Israel onto his side to oppose David. And so Absalom has really made pretty good on these goals at this point, that he has gathered enough popular support to be able to have most of the people on his side. He's driven David and his family and his closest advisors have fled Jerusalem out of fear for their lives and are now hiding in the wilderness. David has left behind a number of key people in Jerusalem that he hopes will help him regain his position as God's anointed king in Israel. But David has also resigned himself to accept God's will in this matter, whatever it may become. And so Absalom has come into Jerusalem. He's taken a number of actions to kind of consolidate his position as king, to solidify that in the eyes of the people, and to help them see that he is the replacement for his father, and they are not going back. And so Absalom at this point is trying to figure out what the next steps are, how it is that he can continue to establish his throne, to ensure that his father David never takes it back. And David is still probably in many ways reeling from this sudden turn of events, waiting to see what happens, waiting on God for God to act. And so we're going to see in the midst of this that we can have hope in any circumstance because God can accomplish his good will through any circumstance. And that's what David is dealing with right here. That he, again, is suffering the consequences for his sin. But big picture, God is still doing good things. God is going to remain faithful. And we see David being able to trust in God as God is at work behind the scenes to orchestrate events the way he wants them to happen. So God is at work, even in the midst of these hard things. We'll be picking up in 2 Samuel chapter 17, starting in verse 1. Moreover, Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Let me choose 12,000 men, and I will rise and pursue David tonight. I will come upon him while he is weary and discouraged, and throw him into a panic. And all the people who are with him will flee. I will strike down only the king, and I will bring all the people back to you, as a bride comes home to her husband. You seek the life of only one man, and all the people will be at peace." And the advice seemed right in the eyes of Absalom and all the elders of Israel. Absalom, again, is in Jerusalem. He's beginning to settle there. He's trying to consolidate his power, and he's conferring with this other man, Ahithophel. So if we jump back to where we'd been, we remember that Ahithophel was one of David's most trusted advisors. We were told in the last chapter that his counsel, at least in political matters, was so good that they saw it as kind of the equivalent of divine inspiration for those practical day-to-day things. They thought, this guy is so wise that we need to heed his advice. And so Ahithophel had at least a little bit of a personal vendetta against David. It's very possible that he was Bathsheba's father, and so he was not happy about what had happened in David's sinful actions here. Whatever the reason, Ahithophel had early on allied himself with Absalom and helped him begin the stages of undermining David's rule, his popularity within the kingdom, and helping Absalom rise to that point of prominence where he could seize control. And so Absalom goes to this wise advisor, Ahithophel, and they're talking, and Ahithophel presents a plan. He says, all right, here's the next step. Here's what we need to do to make sure that this coup is not short-lived, to make sure that you stay right here in Jerusalem as king, and there's no chance of someone coming and taking that from you. And so he says, let me take 12,000 men, 12,000 soldiers. We'll leave tonight. We're going to go chase David into the wilderness. We're going to come find him while he's weary and discouraged, he says, and panicked. And everybody who's with him will just run in there. They'll be in disarray. They won't be ready to fight back. We'll hunt down just David. We will kill just David. Nobody else has to die for this. And then I can bring all these other people that have gone with David back to Jerusalem with me. They will pledge allegiance to you. They'll return to you as the king, he says, as a bride comes home to her husband. That Ahithophel is implying that Absalom is the rightful king here. The people of Israel who have gone with David have run away, and they need to be returned to their rightful ruler in Absalom. And he says, there's only one man who has to die here, and after that, we can have peace. And it says in verse 4 that the advice seemed good to Absalom and to all the elders of Israel. This seems like a pretty sound plan. And I found it interesting when I was studying this chapter, and that Ahithophel says in verse 2, he says, I will come upon David while he's weary and discouraged. And it doesn't necessarily say that that's where David was at this point. But I don't think it's much of a jump to think he probably was a bit weary at this point. He probably was a bit discouraged. That David had waited and trusted God for years to fulfill this promise he had given David, to make him king, to help him to be at peace within his nation, to be ruling over them, to be leading his people in worship and right relationship with God. And then he had had that taken away suddenly, probably somewhat unexpectedly, by his own son. David had been chased out of the city he had captured and built up as the capital, that he had fled away from the central portion of Israel, was kind of on the fringes of what was considered Israel proper at this point, hiding in the wilderness, tired and wondering what would happen next, how God would be at work here, how God could possibly make good of this situation, defend him, and help him through this. And what David's opposers maybe didn't realize, and what David probably did, is that God fights for his people when they're weary and discouraged. That Absalom had this plot. He thought, I will overthrow my father David. We'll get rid of him. Ahithophel brought about the plan to get rid of David altogether. And they thought, this will establish Absalom's rule in his kingdom. He will be king. He will rule. He will make the decisions. He will be solid and in control here. In Psalm chapter 2, the psalmist writes, "Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision." And so what the psalmist is saying there is that the nations and the peoples rage. They plot against the Lord and against his anointed, his people, his chosen rulers, that they can make these plans. And they may seem infallible in the eyes of man. But God, who sits in the heavens, far above all of that, laughs. He says, you have no idea how this is going to work out. Your plan seems airtight and foolproof. But you forgot about me and what I can do. And so even though David is weary and discouraged, I believe at this point, that he doesn't know what's going to happen, God is still at work in the midst of this, even as David's opponents have what seems to be a pretty solid plan that would lead to his demise, that God is still at work protecting David and helping him through this. So Ahithophel presents his plan to Absalom. And the elders and Absalom think, this sounds pretty good, man. I kind of like the sound of that. And then in verse 5, Absalom decides to get a second opinion. It says, then Absalom said, call Hushai the Archite also, and let us hear what he has to say. And when Hushai came to Absalom, Absalom said to him, thus has Ahithophel spoken. Shall we do as he says? If not, you speak. Then Hushai said to Absalom, this time the counsel that Ahithophel has given is not good. So a quick recap of the last couple chapters. So Ahithophel was one of David's advisors who had rebelled with Absalom early on and was trying to see Absalom succeed and see David brought down. Hushai was referred to as a friend of David. And we see him profess his loyalty to David. He tries to leave to flee to the wilderness, but David says, no, I have a better plan. You stay here and try to be my inside man in this rebellion. If you can usurp and kind of overturn the advice that Ahithophel gives Absalom, maybe we'll have a chance to set things right here once more. And so Absalom has called this other wise man, Hushai, into his presence, and he says, all right, what is your advice? What do you think we should do? And Hushai says, I don't think Ahithophel's given you very good advice this time. And so he elaborates on that, starting in verse 8. Hushai said, you know that your father and his men are mighty men, and that they are enraged like a bear robbed of her cubs in the field. Besides, your father is expert in war. He will not spend the night with the people. Behold, even now he has hidden himself in one of the pits or in some other place. And as soon as some of the people fall at the first attack, whoever hears it will say, there has been a slaughter among the people who follow Absalom. Then even the valiant man, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will utterly melt with fear. For all Israel knows that your father is a mighty man, and that those who are with him are valiant men. But my counsel is that all Israel be gathered to you, from Dan to Beersheba, as the sand by the sea for multitude, and that you go to battle in person. So we shall come upon him in some place where he is to be found, and we shall light upon him as the dew falls on the ground, and of him and all the men with him not one will be left. If he withdraws into a city, then all Israel will bring ropes to that city, and we shall drag it into the valley until not even a pebble is to be found there. So Hushai presents an alternative plan of action to Absalom. So Ahithophel's counsel was that they gather a small force, leave immediately, go seek out David personally, kill him, and be done with the whole deal. And Absalom says, that sounds good, let's get a second opinion. So Hushai comes in, and he presents this other idea to Absalom. Again, Hushai is trying to undermine the advice that Ahithophel had given. He knows that this probably would succeed if it was carried out. And so Hushai says, no, this is bad advice. There's a couple things you have to remember about what's going on. Your father and his men are mighty men, he said. We're going to read about that a little bit more towards the end of the book. But David and his closest soldiers, the men who had spent much of their life with him, they were renowned as mighty warriors. There's tales of them defeating forces that greatly outnumbered them, of fighting against people that no one else could defeat, of doing all these great deeds in battle. And so Hushai says, hey, remember, these guys know how to fight. They've been in this position before, hiding in the wilderness, outnumbered, fleeing from the king that was seeking to destroy them. They've seen this before. They know what to do. On top of that, he says, they're enraged. They're going to be angry because you have taken something away from them, like a bear that's had her cubs taken away. They are going to have a chip on their shoulder. They know how to fight, and they have the motivation to fight. And on top of that, he says, your father is an expert in war, that he has been leading people in battle since he was very, very young, that he knows the tactics and strategies that can succeed, that he's familiar with all of these things. And on top of that, he adds, he's probably hidden himself. He says that David knows better than to stay with all the people. He'll be hidden away somewhere where you won't find him, that you won't be able to track him down that easily. And kind of the culmination of all of this that Hushai predicts is that as soon as you send this small group out there, that David and his men are going to strike some of them are going to die, and they're going to think about all of these things, that all the people in Israel are aware of this, that they've heard tales of the mighty deeds of David and his men. And so as soon as someone is killed, as part of your force is defeated, that the most valiant man is going to be afraid, and they're going to flee. And this is going to give David an opportunity to build his forces, to strike back, and to continue to fight against what is happening. And so Hushai presents an alternative plan to Absalom. And I think a lot of this, he's trying to appeal to Absalom's pride in this. He says in verse 11, my counsel is that all Israel be gathered to you, from Dan to Beersheba. And so when we see in the Old Testament, we see that phrase occur several times. So Dan essentially is the very northernmost city within the nation of Israel. And Beersheba is the southernmost. And so in a long, narrow country next to the sea, when somebody says from Dan to Beersheba, they're essentially saying the whole country. We want to gather every fighting man within the nation to you, and we're going to go out and make sure that they don't have any sort of a chance. We're going to get the entire fighting force of the nation. Hushai also advises that Absalom goes to battle in person. He says, gather an unstoppable, insurmountable force. David and his men will be so greatly outnumbered, they'll have no chance. You can lead this army into victory yourself and further establish your position, your power and prestige as the ruler. He says, we'll fall on them as the dew falls on the ground. They'll just be completely covered with our army. Not one will survive. That we're going to show all these people who sided with David that we will not tolerate that Israel must pledge allegiance to you only. And he even says if they run into a city, we'll have so many people, we'll tear down the walls of that city and drag him out, that they will have no chance of survival. And so Hushai gives a very different plan of action than what Ahithophel had already given. And again, Absalom initially thought Ahithophel's advice was pretty good, but when Hushai presents this one, he begins to question that. He has some different thoughts and ideas. And so in verse 14, it says, Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel. For the Lord had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, so that the Lord might bring harm upon Absalom. And I think these verses here, this is probably really the key turning point of this passage, that David is in a bad situation, that his son Absalom has him on the run. He has the initiative. He has the allegiance of most of the people. And had Absalom followed through with this first plan that was presented, it probably would not have gone well for David. But God was at work even in the midst of that. And God's sovereign plan cannot be thwarted. And so in the midst of this seemingly impossible situation, God placed Hushai in this position to be able to present an alternative plan, one that he knew would have less chance of success. And that plan was accepted by Absalom and by the rest of his leaders, not because it was a great plan, not because it was airtight, maybe a little bit because it appealed to his pride and seemed like a glorious way to begin his reign. But the primary reason that that plan was accepted in place of the plan of speed that Ahithophel had given was that the Lord had ordained to defeat the counsel of Ahithophel, that God had planned and purposed that Ahithophel's advice would not be followed so that he might bring harm upon Absalom. So God had a plan through this. God was fighting on behalf of David when David was still on the run and in hiding, not even able to figure out his next move yet. God was still at work, and his plans cannot be stopped. And as we go through life, especially when we face difficulties, sometimes I think it's easy to forget that we see what's right in front of us. And it's so hard to see beyond that, or see around that, or sometimes even to see behind us and remember what we've already been through. And I'm sure David had many questions while all of this was going on, wondering how this would work out, if God had abandoned him, if he had sinned so greatly that God was going to permanently remove him as king. And there were many things he didn't know or understand. But God was still at work, and David was trusting in God. Our perceptions of events, our emotions, don't always reflect the ultimate truth. And that ultimate truth is what God is working to accomplish. That when we face obstacles, hard times, challenges, we see the problem. We see what's in front of us. We can't see all that God sees, and we don't see God working behind the scenes. And so what happens is we get wrapped up in whatever it is that's right there in front of us, the challenges we face, the obstacles in front of us, the impossibility, it seems, of whatever it is working out for good. And we forget that God is able to do so much more than we can see or understand or even ask for. That God is working through those very things to bring about good. And as David was hiding in the wilderness, again, in fear for his life, he probably could not see the end result here. He saw his people turning against him. He saw his son out to kill him. David didn't see how God could work through this to bring something good. My summer job through high school and college. I was working with my dad's construction business. And when you first start building a home, many of you have seen this, what's the first thing you do? You dig a really big hole. And for somebody who's never seen that before, maybe you think of a kid who doesn't understand this process, they might walk up to that and say, okay, here is this nice piece of land. Now we just have a giant hole. I don't see how this is an improvement. In fact, it seems like it looks worse. There's no more grass here. There's mud everywhere. There's tracks from all the heavy equipment. There's just piles of things. How can this be an improvement? And to a small child or someone who doesn't understand that process, they might not be able to see through that mess to see what's going to be the end result, to be able to look at the blueprints and say, look, here's what's going to be here when this is finished. See this beautiful home that's going to be here with the entrance and the windows and the green grass and the lawn. But it started out as a muddy hole in the ground, and that was necessary in order to build that foundation and to start the process of making something beautiful. And oftentimes that's how the hard things in life work. That oftentimes it starts off as a mess, and we can't see how that mess could grow into something better. But God can, and God holds the blueprints, and God is faithful to finish his projects. Verse 15. Then Hushai said to Zadok and Abiathar the priests, thus and so did Ahithophel counsel Absalom and the elders of Israel, and thus and so have I counseled. Now therefore send quickly and tell David, do not stay tonight at the fords of the wilderness, but by all means pass over, lest the king and all the people who are with him be swallowed up. Now Jonathan and Ahimaaz were waiting at En-Rogel. A female servant was to go and tell them, and they were to go and tell King David, for they were not to be seen entering the city. But a young man saw them and told Absalom. So both of them went away quickly and came to the house of a man at Bahurim, who had a well in his courtyard. And they went down into it. And the woman took and spread a covering over the well's mouth and scattered grain on it, and nothing was known of it. When Absalom's servants came to the woman at the house, they said, where are Ahimaaz and Jonathan? And the woman said to them, they have gone over the brook of water. And when they had sought and could not find them, they returned to Jerusalem. So in addition to this wise man, this advisor Hushai, David had left a couple other inside men in Jerusalem to work on his behalf while he was hiding in exile. So Hushai goes to Zadok and Abiathar, the priests. They had also initially tried to flee Jerusalem. David had sent them back saying, no, stay here. I'm trusting that God will either bring me back or God will bring in a new king in place of me. Either way, you need to be here to lead the people in worship. And on top of that, if you're here, perhaps you can send word to me and let me know what's going on and what's happening. And so Hushai sends a message to the two priests, and they tell their sons, okay, here's what's happened. We need to send messengers to David and let him know what's going on. And so they send out these messengers to go tell David, hey, don't stay where you are next to the fords of the river. Cross over the river. Get farther away from what's going on here in case Absalom decides that he does want to send someone sooner after you. Get another obstacle, another barrier between you and Absalom so that you can be safe if he does maybe decide to go with the first plan or to do something quicker than waiting to muster his entire army. And so the sons of the priest, Jonathan and Ahimaaz, were waiting for this message. We're told in verse 17 that a servant was supposed to go and tell them, and they were to go and tell King David. It almost starts to sound kind of like a spy movie or something. You've got the messenger going out and giving them a secret message to the other person, and they take that to the other people. So he has these people helping him on the inside. But there's a little bit of a hitch in the plan. And verse 18, it says that a young man saw Jonathan and Ahimaaz, and he told Absalom. It says that both of them went away quickly. So Absalom has already been informed, hey, these two sons of the priest, there's something a little fishy there. They seem like they're doing something here. And again, this had the potential to be very, very bad for David. That if these messengers were discovered, he wouldn't receive the message. He wouldn't know he needed to flee and hide. They might even have a better chance of figuring out exactly where David was at and how they could track him down and execute him. But these two men come to the house of someone else who apparently was sympathetic towards David, this man in Bahurim. And we're told that this man had a well in the courtyard of his home. And so this would be somewhere fairly inconspicuous. It must have not been a very deep well. And so these two men jump inside of it, and this woman who's working there lays a cloth over it and just pours some grain on top. So it looks like she's just in the process of drying grain in the sun. Nothing suspicious whatsoever. Nothing to see. And so Absalom's servants come there. They realize the men have gone this way. They come and inquire for, hey, where are these guys at? Have you seen them? They came right by here. She tells them, oh, they've crossed over the brook. They must have gone over that way somewhere. Why don't you follow them and see what happens there? Absalom's servants believe her. They continue looking. Eventually they give up and return to Jerusalem. And I think the point of this little mini tale of espionage here in the middle of this is that God is protecting the messengers. Through the messengers, he's protecting David. God is protecting these people through the work of other people. We see in this passage God is sovereignly at work, that God is working to defend and protect David, that God is working to defeat the rule of Absalom, that God is orchestrating plans and events and doing things behind the scenes to accomplish his work. And oftentimes God does that through people. We saw that with the advice that Hushai and Ahithophel gave to Absalom. That God used that advice to accomplish his purposes. And here, God is using the actions of these people who are sympathetic to David to continue to accomplish his plans and his purposes. And it's interesting, and when we see these things happening, it's clear in this passage that God is going to make sure that things happen the way he wants them to happen. But we see people taking an active role within that. God is sovereign over the outcome here, but man still has a responsibility to follow and obey. And these people here in this passage, the messengers, the people who hid the messengers, all of them, they're being faithful to carry out the role God had given them and the opportunities God had given them to help God's anointed king and honor God in that. And they're trusting in God's ability to bring about that outcome, but at the same time, they are working towards that outcome. And it's an interesting concept. It's not that they're just sitting back, waiting on God to do something passively, but they're actively exercising their faith in God, choosing to follow God and to act on that in that given situation. And so that trust in God's sovereignty empowered them to take action. And I think it's the same concept in our own lives, that if we trust in God's sovereignty and his ability to bring about his desired result, then that should help us have confidence to take action, to step out in faith and to trust God, even in the midst of seemingly impossible situations, as with the one here. These people were all, it seems, in the minority within Israel at this point, that had they been discovered, they probably would have been executed by Absalom. That he would not have looked kindly on someone trying to aid his father, whom he was seeking to put to death. But these people trusted in God and chose to do what is right, knowing that God would work things out the way they needed to be. And oftentimes when God is at work, it's through means just like that. That we should not be surprised when God does extraordinary things through ordinary means. that God was at work, protecting David, working to bring him back to the throne of Israel. But he was doing that through the actions of normal people choosing to do what's right. That God can do amazing things through the lives of people who just choose to trust and to follow him. And that should be an encouragement for all of us, that God can do great things in and through us just by us doing the seemingly ordinary tasks of obedience and trust. That if we are just faithfully following God day by day, making choices that honor him through the seemingly mundane things of life, that eventually those things can add up to be something great or can help prepare us for something that could be amazing. That God is at work even through ordinary day-to-day life. Verse 21. After they had gone, the men came up out of the well and went and told King David. They said to David, "Arise and go quickly over the water, for thus and so has Ahithophel counseled against you." Then David arose and all the people who were with him, and they crossed the Jordan. By daybreak, not one was left who had not crossed the Jordan. So the messengers get through because of the work and the protection of God. They carry the message to David. David hears what Ahithophel has done. And so he gathers the people together. They cross the Jordan River over the night. And it says, by daybreak, not one was left who had not crossed over the Jordan River. And so David, his closest people, his family, the soldiers who had remained loyal to him, they've crossed the Jordan River. They've set an extra physical boundary between them and Absalom, helping ensure their safety as God is continuing at work through this. In these verses here, God has brought David to a place of safety, that even in the midst of everything that was going on, David was safe here because God was with him and God was directing him. And God can be trusted to bring his people to safety. And in this case, it was a very immediate physical move of safety. But David had faith in God, not just because of that, but David trusted in God because he knew that God would be faithful to bring him to a place of safety eternally. David writes in Psalm 23, verse 6, "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever." And so David's hope was in God. He knew that whatever circumstances came, even if this rebellion led to his death, that his place in the presence of God was secure. And that no matter what happened, he could rest in that. And so David was able to trust God to bring him to a point of safety, regardless of what happened to him physically. He knew that God would be faithful through eternity, which is so much more important than whatever would happen in the immediate in this life. And we have that same hope that David had, that we can rest in the hope that our eternity is secure, that no matter what happens, that the challenges and difficulties of life in a fallen world pale in comparison with the glory of eternal life and the presence of our Creator. And nothing can take that away from us. And so we have hope regardless of our circumstances because of that. I feel like I've had a lot of car stories in sermons lately, but I was on vacation one time with my family. I was a kid, and my dad was a fairly accomplished shade tree mechanic, so there was always something exciting going on. You know, it's a large family in an old car driving halfway across the country. What could possibly go wrong? And so we were one time making a trip to California to go to the beach. And we're somewhere in the desert in the middle of nowhere. I don't remember if it was Nevada or Arizona or something. And I believe it was the alternator on the Suburban went out. And so we limp into town. So we must have been right on the edge of town somewhere. And I remember pulling into this Walmart parking lot, and there's an auto parts store across the way from it. So we get there, and my dad goes into the store and finds the replacement part, brings it back, and I help him. I'm handing him wrenches or something, whatever as a 10-year-old does to help. And he changes it out, and things happen. We get pooped on by a bird flying over, and it's this whole ordeal. I'm sure it was less than fun for my parents. But we got the car back together, got back on the road, and continued our trip to the beach. And for me, as a kid, this really didn't seem like a terrible deal. Without a full comprehension of the potential severity of what's going on, I'm just, okay, it's an adventure. Something happened to the car. Dad's got it taken care of. So at that point, I was trusting in my Father to work through the challenge that had arisen and to bring us safely to our destination. That I knew, there's a problem. Dad's pretty good at this. He'll be able to fix it. And he's going to keep driving, and we're going to get to the place we're staying, and we're going to go to the beach, and we're going to play in the water and make hot dogs and whatever else. And I was trusting in my Father's ability to bring us through that challenge and bring us safely to the end. And that's just how God works in our own lives. That challenges can arise, but they seem so much less imposing when we can trust in our Father, knowing that He is able to work through those challenges and that He is faithful to bring us safely to our destination. That God is able to work through whatever happens to help us overcome any challenge, and that He will ensure that we get safely home to be with Him at the end. And so we don't have to worry about whatever happens along the way, if we can step back for a moment and trust that God is at work even through those hard things. Verse 23, when Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he saddled his donkey and went off home to his own city. He set his house in order and hanged himself, and he died and was buried in the tomb of his father. That's a nice, cheery little diversion from where we've been. So Ahithophel, at this point, has essentially despaired of the rebellion, that he was one of the early allies of Absalom, that he sees that his advice was not followed. And either from shame over his advice being turned down, or perhaps out of fear, knowing what David might do upon his return, Ahithophel goes back to his home, sets his affairs in order, and hangs himself. And this one, it seems like a bit of an odd kind of inclusion here, that we see just kind of this dark, sad little side story in the midst of this rebellion. I think there's a few things we can note in the midst of that. First off, that those who oppose God are not headed for a good end. That Ahithophel had rebelled against God's anointed king, his special chosen ruler over his people Israel. That he had placed himself in a pretty bad situation by his own choosing and his own doing. And he did not repent of that or seek to make that better. And so he was not headed for a good end. The other thing that I think is interesting with this is it reminds us that God's plan surpasses our immediate circumstances and leads to an end that's greater than what we can imagine. Now, how does the suicide of a rebel against God do that? So, you may have noticed a little bit of this story. There's more than a few parallels between what we see David doing and what we see in the life of Jesus. That David was God's anointed king over his people. Jesus is the eternal king reigning on David's throne over God's people. That David was rejected by his people and forced to flee. Jesus was rejected by the very people he came to rule over and to save. David crossed over the Kidron Brook, leaving Jerusalem, headed to the Mount of Olives in sorrow over the rejection by his people. Jesus left Jerusalem, crossed the Kidron River, went to the Mount of Olives in sorrow over the rejection of his people and the difficulty that he knew was going to come. David was betrayed by a close advisor who realized what he had done and went and hanged himself in despair after what had happened. Jesus was betrayed by one of his closest men who later went and hanged himself, realizing what he had done. There's many points within this story that surpass what's going on in the life of David, that go beyond that, and again give a foreshadowing of the work that God would do to redeem his people unto himself, not just temporarily in Israel thousands of years ago, but for all time. God's work is so much bigger than what we can see right in front of us in any given moment. And it's important that we not get fixated on just the little things right here, but that we trust that God is doing more than we can know or understand, that God has a plan that's greater than we can imagine, and that God's work leads to hope. Of course, the end result of the story that this foreshadows is the crucifixion of Christ, followed by his resurrection and ascension to heaven. The darkest moment in human history, the time where the one man who deserved life was killed on behalf of the many. The worst thing that could possibly happen, God used to purchase redemption for people so that they might know him, love him, and be with him forever. We can have hope because God works through the darkness, through the difficulties, through the hard things in life, and brings something beautiful out of them. That's why we have hope. Verse 24. Then David came to Mahanaim, and Absalom crossed the Jordan with all the men of Israel. Now Absalom had set Amasa over the army instead of Joab. Amasa was the son of a man named Ithra the Ishmaelite, who had married Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, sister of Zeruiah, Joab's mother. And Israel and Absalom encamped in the land of Gilead. So David has crossed the Jordan River, and he comes to the city of Mahanaim. Absalom at this point has gathered his army, the host of the nation of Israel. They've crossed the Jordan River. They're coming in, closing in on David and his men. And we're reminded here that Absalom, again, David's son, that he set this other man over his army, Amasa. We get kind of a confusing explanation of his relation. But essentially, Amasa was related to both Joab and David. This is very much a personal civil war, but also an interfamilial conflict even. That David has been betrayed by people who should have been very close to him and should have been submissive to him. And even though we know God is working here, at this point I'm sure there's another moment where the outlook was pretty grim for David. That he's been betrayed by his nation, by his family. They're outnumbered. The army is closing in on him. And he doesn't know how things are going to pan out. And even when God is at work, those hard times can come. And sometimes the darkest times and the most impossible situations are the things that can open the door for unmistakable divine intervention. Those hard things remind us of our dependence upon God and present opportunities for God to work in a way that we could not attribute to anyone else. In 2 Corinthians verse 9, Paul talks about being burdened beyond their strengths, that they despaired of life itself. But he says it was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead. that despair, that burden, that hard time reminded Paul that he did not rely on himself, but he relied on God, who was faithful through all things and was able to raise the dead, that God was able to do those very things. In Deuteronomy 8, verse 3, this is quoted by Jesus when he's tempted by the devil. Moses is speaking to the people of Israel about their time in the desert. And he says, "And he humbled you and let you hunger, and fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of God." God allowed the people of Israel to go without while they were in the desert, to remind them that their dependence, that the most important thing was that relationship with God and His Word, that they needed that more than they needed bread to subsist on, that they needed spiritual food even more so, that God uses hard things to grow our faith, to remind us of our dependence on Him, and to present opportunities for Him to do great things to build our faith and to bring glory unto Himself. Verse 27, when David came to Mahanaim, Shobi the son of Nahash from Rabbah of the Ammonites, and Machir the son of Amiel from Lo-debar, and Barzillai the Gileadite from Rogelim, brought beds, basins, and earthen vessels, wheat, barley, flour, parched grains, beans, lentils, honey, and curds, and sheep and cheese from the herd for David and the people with him to eat. For they said, "The people are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness." And so, even in this time of testing, when David is suffering consequences and some level of discipline for his sins, God is proving that He is faithful to David. God is delivering David through this situation. God is working behind the scenes to save David, to bring him back to his rightful place as king. God is defending David and protecting him. And we see here that God is providing for David through these other men who came and brought supplies into David and his men in the wilderness. God is still at work. And we're reminded here that God cares about the needs of His people. Yes, God is growing David. He's building his faith. On some level, He's disciplining him. God is working this out to bring about something good in the end. But even in the midst of all of that, God is still caring about David and the other people with him. That God saw that they were hungry and weary and thirsty. And God sent these other people to bring supplies and to care for them. God cares about His people. And even when it feels like things are impossible, like God has turned His back on us, like there's no hope moving forward, we have to remember, not only is God at work behind the scenes to bring about something good, not only has God secured our eternal destiny, but God cares about us in those moments. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we're guaranteed to have ease or success. But we can take heart knowing that God hears us, that God knows what we're facing, and that God will care for us in those situations. 1 Peter 5:7 tells us to cast all our anxieties on God because He cares for you. Romans 8:31 and 32 says, "What shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare His own Son, but gave Him up for us all, how will He not also with Him graciously give us all things?" God knows what you're up against. He knows what you're facing. He knows how you feel and what you need. And He cares, and He's at work to bring good. We can have hope in any circumstance because God can accomplish His good will through any circumstance. Let's go to Him in prayer. Thank you, Father, that You are so good. good. I thank you that you are so powerful, Lord, that you are sovereign over all that happens, and that you are able to bring good out of any situation, Lord. I thank you for just this example we see in the life of David, of you at work, through people, through different events, through just so many challenges, God, that you knew what was going to happen, that you were orchestrating events to ensure that it would, Lord, and that you were faithful, even though David had been unfaithful. I pray that you'd help us to take heart in those things, to rest in your sovereignty, Lord, to trust in your ability to bring about good through anything, God, and to trust overall, more than anything else, that you will bring us safely home to you. I pray that we would rest in your power and your will, Lord, and trust in that hope that we have in the gospel. I pray that that would empower us in our lives, that we would be able to seek you and to honor you no matter what may come. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Please stand and join me as we close in worship. Children then, you hear your children now. You are the same God, you are the same God. You answered prayers back then, and you will answer now. You are the same God, you are the same God. You were providing then, you are providing now. You are the same God. You are the same God. You move in power then. God move in power now. You are the same God. You are the same God. Oh God, my God, I need you. Oh God, my God, I need you now. Oh, I need you now. Oh rock of ages, I'm standing on your faithfulness. On your faithfulness. Thanks for joining us this evening. Have a blessed night, and can't wait to see you all soon.